There is a kind of reaction that surprises even the person having it. Not the anger itself, not the tears, but the size of it. The way it spills past the edges of the moment, floods the room, and leaves everyone, including you, standing in something that feels disproportionate. A comment was made, a tone was used, a look crossed someone's face, and something inside you moved, not gently. It moved the way old furniture moves when you finally push it, releasing dust, shifting weight, revealing what had been sitting underneath for years without being named. You told yourself it was about what just happened. Maybe you still believe that. But the truth is quieter and older than today. Some reactions are not responses to the present. They are visitations from the past. And the moment that triggered you, that small, ordinary moment, was never really the point. She had always considered herself a measured person. Not cold, not detached. Just someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that composure was safer than expression. She had practiced it without knowing she was practicing it, at dinner tables where voices rose and no one listened, in classrooms where being too much made you a target, in relationships where she had slowly learned to keep the volume of herself turned low. She had built something functional out of all of that, a life that moved, a job she was good at, friendships that felt most of the time like enough. And then one afternoon her colleague said something in passing. It was not cruel, it was not even particularly thoughtless. A mild remark about her work, a half sentence, really, spoken on the way out of a meeting room. She nodded, she smiled, she walked back to her desk. And then she sat down and something cracked open. She could not explain the feeling to herself. It was too big for the comment. It was heavier than the moment deserved. There was anger in it, and under the anger there was something older, something that felt less like a reaction and more like a recognition. She spent the rest of the afternoon trying to push it back down. By the time she got home, she had managed to reduce it to something she could carry, but it followed her into the evening, into the night. She kept returning to the same question. Why did that hit so hard? There's a concept that Carl Jung described as a complex, not a flaw and not a weakness, but a cluster of feeling and memory that lives beneath the surface of awareness. A pocket of the psyche that has its own weight, its own charge, its own history. When something in the present touches that cluster, even lightly, the response does not come only from today. It comes from every layer of experience that has been pressed into that same shape over time. The comment her colleague made was not the wound, it was the pressure, and the wound was old. This is not a comfortable thing to consider. It requires a kind of honesty that goes against the instinct to stay focused on the surface, on the person who said the thing, on the fairness of the situation, on whether the reaction was justified. Justified is the wrong question. The more patient question is, where have I felt this before? Not because the present doesn't matter, but because the present is rarely acting alone. Most people, when they experience a reaction that feels too large for the moment, try to bring it back to scale. They minimize it, they reason with it. They remind themselves that they are an adult, that this is a professional setting, that the person probably meant nothing by it. And they push the feeling back down as efficiently as they know how. But pushing a feeling back down is not the same as understanding where it came from. It is management. And management, however useful in the short term, is not the same as resolution. There is a particular kind of internal conversation that happens in these moments, a negotiation between the feeling and the explanation. The feeling says, this is important. The explanation says, no, you are overreacting. And most of the time, the explanation wins. Not because it is right, but because it is louder and because it offers what the feeling cannot, a way to continue with the afternoon. Jung was deeply interested in what the psyche does with experience that has not been processed, not just trauma in its dramatic forms, but the quieter accumulations, the repeated small disappointments, the needs that went unmet without ceremony, the feelings that were expressed once and met with silence, and so were not expressed again. These things do not evaporate, they settle. They form a kind of sediment in the interior life, layers of unfinished emotional business that compress into something dense over time. And that density is exactly what Jung meant by a complex. It is not disorder, it is unfinished order. She had felt that feeling before, not in that office, not with that colleague, long before any of that, in rooms where her effort went unacknowledged, in moments where being capable was not quite enough, in the quiet accumulation of instances where what she offered was received without care. The comment had touched all of it at once, and that is why it felt so enormous. Here is the uncomfortable part. If the reaction is not entirely about the present, then managing the present will not entirely resolve it. You can smooth things over. You can have the conversation, clarify the misunderstanding, receive the apology if one comes, and still feel something unfinished. Because the thing that was activated is not waiting for resolution from this situation. It is waiting for something else entirely. There is a reason certain people seem to find the same wound wherever they go. A different job, a different relationship, a different city, and yet somehow the same feeling arrives. The same contraction in the chest, the same old story beginning again. It can feel like bad luck, like the world is arranged against you, like you keep choosing the wrong people or landing in the wrong rooms. But Jung would suggest something harder to hear. What we carry inside us shapes what we perceive outside us. The wound that has not been looked at does not disappear. It waits, and it finds with remarkable precision exactly the situations that will make it known. Not because life is cruel, but because something in us is still trying to understand what happened, still looking for the moment where the old pain finally gets to be seen. There is another layer to this, something even less comfortable to sit with. When an old wound keeps being activated, the mind tends to do one of two things. It either points outward at the people who keep failing us, at the world that keeps repeating the pattern, or it points inward as accusation, as evidence of something fundamentally broken. Neither of those directions is particularly useful. The outward pointing keeps us in a posture of waiting to be rescued or corrected by other people. The inward accusation compounds the original injury with shame. Jung was not interested in either direction. He was interested in consciousness, in the slow, unglamorous work of simply becoming aware of what is actually operating inside you, not so you can fix it immediately, not so you can be different by tomorrow, but so that you are no longer living at the mercy of something you cannot see. The unexamined complex does not ask for your permission. It does not announce itself. It simply moves through your reactions, your interpretations, your choices, invisible but very much present. And the first act of any real shift is just this, to notice it, to name it however imprecisely, to say without judgment something old just moved. That noticing does not resolve the wound, but it changes the relationship to it. And that change over time is what makes the difference. Jung called the unexamined parts of ourselves the shadow. Not the darkness we are afraid others will see, though that is part of it, but the aspects of experience, feeling, and identity that we have pushed out of conscious awareness because they were too much, too painful, or too inconvenient to hold. The shadow is not malevolent. It is simply what did not get integrated. For her, the shadow held the part of herself that had wanted to be seen and had learned instead to be useful. The part that had needed to be told that her effort mattered and had learned instead to need less. The part that had once expressed hurt and had been met with impatience, so it learned to present composure instead. None of those decisions had been wrong. They had been intelligent adaptations. They had helped her survive environments that were not designed with her full expression in mind. But adaptations outlast their usefulness. The skills that protected a younger version of you can become the walls that confuse a current one. It is worth pausing on this for a moment because it is easy to read this as criticism, as though the suggestion is that she had done something wrong by learning to manage herself so carefully. But that is not the point. The point is that the self has a memory that is longer and more faithful than the conscious mind. Long after the original environment was left behind, long after the dinner tables and the classrooms and the early relationships became history, the learned patterns remained, not because she had failed to grow, but because the psyche does not simply discard what it once needed. It stores it. It maintains it just in case. And in that maintenance, it sometimes applies the old pattern to a new situation, one that shares just enough surface resemblance to activate the whole old system. This is what projection means in Jung's framework, not just the well-known phenomenon of attributing our own feelings to others, but the broader tendency to see the present through the templates of the past, to respond to what something resembles rather than what it actually is. Her colleague's comment resembled something. It carried the faint shape of something older, a room, a tone, a particular silence that had followed her words on some other day. Her nervous system did not stop to conduct an audit. It recognized the shape and it responded to the history of that shape. Not to the colleague, to the echo. And this is where the reaction becomes almost informative if you are willing to look at it that way. The size of the feeling is a kind of signal. It is the psyche pointing at something, not elegantly, not without collateral disturbance, but pointing nonetheless. The disproportionate reaction is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that something is unresolved. And unresolved is simply another way of saying not yet seen. When her colleague made that remark, it was not just a comment about her work. It was a match struck near something that had been gathering for a long time. The reaction was disproportionate only in relation to the present. In relation to everything that preceded it, it was almost precise. There is something almost relieving about this, once you let it settle. If the wound is old, then the person who activated it today is not the author of it. They may have been careless, they may have been thoughtless, but they did not create the wound. They only found it the way a foot finds a bruise in the dark. This distinction matters. Not because it removes accountability from the people in your life, but because it frees you from a particular kind of helplessness, the feeling that your emotional life is entirely at the mercy of what other people say and do. That if the right things are said and done around you, you will be fine, and if the wrong things happen, you will fall apart. That version of living places the control entirely outside yourself. And it is exhausting, more exhausting perhaps than the wound itself, because it requires a constant vigilance, scanning the environment for threat, monitoring the people around you for signs that the old thing is about to happen again. It turns ordinary interaction into a kind of surveillance, and it keeps you in a permanent state of readiness for pain. Jung's idea of individuation, the long, slow process of becoming a more whole person, begins precisely here. Not in the resolution of external conflicts, but in the willingness to turn toward the interior one. To ask not only, why did they do that, but what in me just woke up and why? The outer situation will always present something. That is the nature of being alive among other people. But what it presents to each person is different, shaped by the interior landscape each person brings to the encounter. Two people can receive the same comment and have entirely different reactions, not because one is stronger or more emotionally stable than the other, but because they each bring a different interior history to the moment. One may hear a neutral observation. The other may hear an echo of something that was said in a completely different context years ago by someone who mattered in a completely different way. What you react to most strongly is often what you have not yet made peace with inside yourself. That is not a judgment, it is an observation, and it contains, quietly, the beginning of something more honest. She did not have a revelation that evening. Life rarely works that way. But something shifted, quietly, in the space between one thought and the next. She began to notice that the feeling she had carried home from work was not, at its center, about her colleague. It was about something much older and much more personal. A version of herself that had wanted, for a very long time, to be received without having to earn it. To have her effort matter simply because she was the one who made it. That was not an unreasonable thing to want. It had never been unreasonable. But it had been buried under enough years of managing and composing and presenting competence that she had almost stopped knowing it was there. Almost stopped believing she was still carrying it. The comment had found it anyway. There is something almost tender in that once you can hold it without judgment. The psyche does not forget what it needs. It keeps asking in new situations, with new people in new forms for what it never fully received. Not to punish you, not to sabotage you, but because something in you is still oriented toward wholeness, and wholeness requires that the old rooms get opened eventually. Not to relive them, not to be defined by them, but to finally see what was in them, and to let that seeing be enough. Jung believed that the movement toward wholeness was never a straight line. It was not a process of becoming a better, tidier, more resolved version of yourself. It was something stranger and more honest than that, a gradual expansion of what you were willing to be aware of. An increasing tolerance for the full complexity of your own interior, the light parts and the unlit parts. The capable self that shows up every day and does the work, and the older self underneath, still holding something it never quite put down. Individuation does not ask you to heal everything. It asks you to know yourself more honestly, to be in less unconscious conflict with who you actually are. That is a different kind of goal than most people pursue. It does not promise relief on any particular timeline. It does not produce a cleaner, calmer version of events, but it does produce something real, a relationship with yourself that is less managed and more true. She did not need to confront her colleague. She did not need to resolve the afternoon into something tidy. She only needed to sit with the recognition that the size of her reaction had told her something true, that the feeling had come from somewhere real, that the young version of herself who had learned to compress her own needs into smaller and smaller containers had not disappeared. She had just been waiting to be acknowledged. That acknowledgement did not need to come from anyone else. It could come from here, from this quiet moment of simply knowing. There is no grand gesture required, no confession to make, no confrontation to stage, no transformation to perform. Just the small, private act of turning toward what is actually there and saying without judgment, "I see you. I know where you came from. You make sense." You are not overreacting. You are simply meeting something that has been waiting longer than today. The question was never whether your reaction made sense in the room where it happened. The question is what room, older and quieter, it was actually responding to. The next time something lands harder than it should, there is no urgency to explain it away. No need to convince yourself that you are being too sensitive or that you should have handled it better. No need to immediately locate the fault in the other person or to immediately locate it in yourself. There is only the possibility of a small, honest pause. Something old was touched. That is not a failure of the present. It is an invitation from the past to look gently at what is still asking to be understood. You do not have to resolve it today. You do not have to resolve it at all in any final or permanent sense. Integration is not a destination. It is a direction, and it does not require that you have everything figured out. It only requires that you remain curious about yourself, about the patterns you carry, about the distance between the reaction you have and the moment that produced it. And the fact that you felt it, the fact that something in you recognized the shape of an old wound, even in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, means that some part of you is still oriented toward that direction. Still paying attention. Still moving, however slowly, toward something more whole. That is not overreacting. That is the quiet work of becoming.